Um, Not well. Again, my experience with IBM was primarily in court, so I can speak to their legal counsel, who did a deposition of me, and then their so-called outside counsel, their hired attorneys, the chief of whom was a guy named Robert Weber. And Robert Weber, he was the primary defense attorney in the San Jose lawsuit. He was very slick and very almost down-home friendly to the jury. The attorneys in the deposition were not like that at all. They were mean. They were actually trying to either wear me out, as I said, or undermine me in some way. I mean, that's not unique to IBM, but their in-house counsel, the IBM attorney in-house, was very, I would say, nefarious. And I will use that word on camera. The court attorney, this was the guy from Jones Day, was not. He was much more of the style that you described. Here, you try it, jury. Here's what I think is going on. Now see what you think is going on, and see if we don't agree, and sort of persuasive in that way. Then after the trial was over, that same person, Robert Weber, was interviewed by something called the Bureau of National Affairs newsletter, BNA newsletter, and he made the famous quote, "Dr. Clapp's study gives junk science a bad name." That's from Robert Weber. And so, like I say, it was peer-reviewed and published in an online journal, so it met the test. It's not junk science, and it doesn't give anything a bad name. It's truthful science, actually. So I disagreed with what he said after the trial was over, but he didn't say anything like that to the jury. I just asked his questions, as they always do. And then you should know that Robert Weber got a new job, and he's now the chief legal counsel for IBM. He's now the in-house, I think he's the vice president for legal affairs. So I guess you'd say he got his paid dues or something like that from having won this big lawsuit for them. So in any case, that's about all I can say in terms of the Rogers stuff.
Does being retired allow you to use the word nefarious a lot more
freely? Sure, yeah, it does. Yep. They can't do nothing to me now.
Okay, so we are back. We are back after a little bit of a delay. However, we're going to touch on some bullet points early on. I know the semester is coming to a grinding halt. And hopefully you guys have received my emails about, my thoughts on, what a final project would look like. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going over the guidelines and all that, although I think that it would behoove us to at least touch upon just a couple of really important bullet points when it comes to final projects. After a lot of, I think I'm repeating myself, after a lot of soul searching with all of this, I know and that, we've all been kind of through the ringer. And I think that, we've had, I think that, a lot of you have been in struggle mode about as much as, if not more than I have, in terms of migrating everything over into a not whatever they call it, distance learn, whatever appellation they give to this whole dehumanizing, anti-human pedagogical, if you want to call it pedagogy, milieu that we have found ourselves in. I would like to call it and for those of you that have read anything on data surveillance and surveillance capitalism, I would basically rechristen the whole affair the pedagogy of data surveillance, the pedagogy of data surveillance, and you know how I feel about that, and anybody that wants to know more about this non-human turn that is descending upon us in terms of education, I would strongly suggest reading Shoshana Zuboff's recent book on the age of surveillance capitalism. To understand, but trying to retain the human element is going to be a real challenge for us. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. I really do. I think that the Greeks had it right in the Socratic process of being in a room in which and ironically it falls into what we have to talk about today, the interview, and the whole idea of an interview. We'll talk about this. He starts with a quote in chapter 8 on the interview. Berger starts with a quote from M.M. Bakhtin, a famous Russian literary theorist, about the nature of the interview. But we'll get to that. But anyway, final projects. People have asked me about final projects. Some of you, seem to have no problem in generating an idea for a final project. And, it's like I said, I wanted to keep the page counts down. I don't expect anybody to reinvent the wheel at this point, due to the situation, due to the uncertainties of the situations that are coming up the road, folks. It's like, buckle your seatbelts and, get in line for America Incorporated's grand reopening sale. We'll see how that works or doesn't. So I wanted to, it's going to be pretty much, a replay of the book report. You're going to have the option, but, once again, you're going to have the option of doing instead of a 5 to 7 page paper, I want 3 to 5 pages on something related to, and I gave you guys the options that I thought were, really viable options. For instance, a whole lion's share of chapters, were, we just didn't have the time to cover them. We didn't have the time to cover them. I had to do a new setup in here. For some reason, I was getting a hum in my recorder, and it didn't like the computer for a second. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it just didn't like the computer. So if you're going to do an essay, it's if you're just going to stay in the written form, it's going to be 3 to 5 pages. If you're going to do a PowerPoint and a paper, it's going to be a 2 to 3 page paper with a PowerPoint. Or if you're going to do a video with a PowerPoint, you're going to keep it within 10 minutes. 10 to 20 minutes, depending on, people always ask me, it's people will ask me, well, how long does it have to be? And it's usually when we do presentations in a brick and mortar setting, it's I need to schedule them out, and it's well, if 6 people are going to do presentations in an hour and 15 minutes, you get this block of time. But under the current circumstances, if you wanted to do a 2-hour documentary, please don't. You would have that luxury due to the fact that we're going to be uploading stuff. We're going to be uploading stuff. Final day for uploads would be Tuesday, May 19th. And then I'm going to give a grace period. I won't get to the grades until 2 days later. So I figure that if you want to do due diligence and comment on some of your, this is going to be an extra credit thing. If you want to go, hopefully if everything goes smoothly, you're going to upload your project on Tuesday, and then Wednesday, if you got nothing else going on, if you're not like, solving the world's hunger crisis or, attempting to, complete the Human Genome Project, you may, pry yourself away from Instagram long enough to like look at some of your peers' stuff and comment on it. You might want to make a comment, and I will look for that, and I'll take that into consideration, because when things are normal, remember when things were normal, there would be this interaction involved with the presentation, the presenter, and your peers, and there would be a dialogue. There would be a dialogue involved with that. So I would say, and it's like I always have been a big stickler about people showing up to presentations, or film shows or whatever it is, due to the fact that, it's just proper etiquette to support your peers. It's like if you put a lot of work into a project, or if you put a lot of work into a film, you would, and you want people to see it just like they want you to see your thing. So there's that. What's it about? What is it? What can it be about? Once again, somebody already stepped up to do the chapter on surveys that we're not going to get a chance to do, but I really wanted to do it. All right. The only we're going to do interviews, and we're going to do content analysis. We're going to do those two chapters. That's about the amount of temporal real estate that we still have, and I think that those are important, aspects of mass media research, that we should, give a parting glance to, doing how to do interviews, and Berger will have certain ideas about interviews. In a very, very wide, he has a very wide conception of what interviews are used for. All right, and the chapter tends to kind of minimize, for instance, the whole film interview, the documentary interview. He's not really a documentary guy. I kind of am, So it's just, this will be kind of a combination of what he has to say about interviews and a combination about what I have to say about interviews. Why am I qualified to talk about interviews? All right. Okay, let's see. Worked for Broadcast News for about 5 years. Conducted numerous hundreds of interviews. And to be honest with you, it's like I would say that my favorite interview during that whole period of time was with a 7-year-old kid at a Halloween parade that was dressed up like it's like I met George Pataki, I met Geraldine Ferraro, I met all kinds of people, I met Andrew Cuomo. My most interesting interview during that period of my emotional adolescence was with a kid at a Halloween parade playing an ear of corn, and I wish I could find it, but it was just scintillating, and it was as good, if not better, than the talks between the world famous interviews between the journalist, the television journalist David Frost and Richard Nixon. Those were a famous series of conversations that they had, which were actually turned into a film, turned into like a narrative film called Frost Nixon. It's a really good film. It's a pretty good film. The actual talks too are pretty good if you can find them. They're probably on YouTube. But what's my background? And as a documentary filmmaker and as a documentary filmmaking teacher, I kind of have a handle on how to conduct interviews. And interviews are a very, very slippery beast, and they serve different functions. When I'm teaching documentary, it's like it's an entirely different kind of game wherein you're building a story and you're looking for certain things at certain times, as opposed to, there's two different modalities here. there's the whole idea that Berger concentrates on of what is what is oral history. Oral history, which is very, very important, and a lot of great documentaries are done within the oral history modality. You know, a person that would stand out in terms of being a documentary filmmaker that makes oral histories would be like Ken Burns. Ken Burns is definitely within that crowd of interviewers that is looking for oral histories to put together. You know, as opposed to maybe, for instance, you know, a filmmaker or an interviewer like Michael Moore, you know, who's more into gleaning information or building an argument, you know, or attempting to you know, build some argument. And sometimes, you know, and his style, due to his genre, is a lot more confrontational. It's a lot more confrontational, you know. Two of the so to round that whole why am I it's like, and as an aside, you know, at one point in graduate school, Bongiorno, you know, made a decision on the advice of his mentor / advisor to take a course on interviews, a grad course on interviews, with a professor that ultimately, you know, very early in the game, it became apparent that, one, I knew a lot more about interviews and giving interviews and what an interview was than she did. She had all kinds of highfalutin ideas about what an interview was and wasn't. Had a lot more flight time than this person. And two, she really didn't like me due to that fact, you know. So instead of just like throwing whatever it was, $3,500 down the toilet, flush, you know, Bongiorno decides to go, bye, and, you know, it's like, and now it's like, you know, I'm teaching it, you know. So I'll tell you what I know about interviews. I started this with a clip from an interview that I did with an epidemiologist from Boston University by the name of Richard Clapp. Dr. Clapp, who's now retired, was a little funny interchange at the end of a interview that I was doing with him for my documentary on the IBM Endicott spill. Different interviews call for different talents, different, you know, it's a question of style. Once again, you know, we go back to like rhetoric and discourse analysis, and every different interaction, you know, calls for, there's nothing hard and fast. There's no hard and fast rules about, I mean, there's certain general protocols, one can say, with conducting an interview. But all of that, one needs to be very improvisational, too, a lot of times. And two things. I am posting an interview, a written interview, an interview done with a person that was done as a kind of oral history / investigative interview that was done using we'll talk about transcribing interviews that was done with a transcription device, and I want to be able to get you to contrast an interview that a written interview, you know, or an interview that ultimately finds itself on the printed page, as opposed to, you know, an interview, you know, a video interview or a radio interview or something like that. So that content is going to be on Blackboard. I will make you aware of it once this goes up. So there's that. Getting back and just finishing up with the final projects. You know, people asking me about what to be doing for a final project. You can do one of the chapters that we have not covered. You know, unpack it. Unpack it like I do, but don't spend an hour and 15 minutes doing it. spend 15 minutes doing it, which is a challenge in itself. And I'll tell you right now, if you go up that path and you decide to do a summary project of one of the chapters that we didn't do, the challenge therein lies in reining it in and being able to do it in a certain period of time. Because I find that, and this is just because fun journal likes to do a lot of this. It's like sometimes I think I can knock out a chapter. I can knock out a chapter in an hour 15, and come to find out it takes me a couple of different lectures. And it's not due to. I would like to think it's not due to incompetence on my part. I think it has to do with being able to gauge how much time something needs to be unpacked. So you've got that. The other suggestion that I threw out to you guys was the idea of taking the content of taking the topic, taking the core of your book report, whatever the given issue was. Whether you were reading a book on the drug pandemic or global warming or public relations or whatever, to take the corpus of your book, whatever your book was about, and maybe do a project that involves giving it a local twist, giving it, for instance, say you did War on Us, I don't know I can't remember who did War on Us, about the pharmaceutical companies and addiction and all that. You might want to do a project where you just kind of, pick up the phone and call a local drug treatment center and maybe do a phone interview for your essay. Write an essay about the state of things, in your backyard. How do these global issues, that guys like Matt Taibbi and Chris Hedges and Jeremy Rifkin, how do these global treatments of issues trickle down to our daily lives, or do they, can you make a case for that? Can you make a case of how, for instance, the neoliberalism's attack on higher education has personally affected you? If you read the Giroux book, somebody did. I haven't seen that report yet. So there's the whole idea of localizing your subject. You might want to tackle something a little more theoretical, but at this stage in the game, and I had touched base with even Margaret Bates about it, the idea of doing real quantitative analysis in a class and an undergraduate class that lasts 15 weeks is very, very hard, but, I wouldn't be adverse to somebody say putting together a survey. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. I ultimately, and if people want access to that, my final project for the grad class I took had to do with a focus group. I did a focus group on a film in progress that I was working on, and had a questionnaire and had a bunch of other a combination of people, of documentary filmmakers or people or other students that were into documentary filmmaking, watched the film, and then and then we had a focus group where people shared their ideas and their thoughts and feelings on the film, and after having a questionnaire, and I videotaped the focus group and, came to certain conclusions in that paper. If you want to see that paper, I can make it available. It was a good paper. I got an A, And in fact, Margaret came back to me the next semester and asked me if I wanted to, she was like, can you send me that paper again? I want to use it as an example. It's this is all modesty aside, Margaret comes back to me and says, can I use your paper as an example for other grad students of what I was going to say what not to do, but what to do, doing stuff like that. But at this stage of the game, we've got like less than 2 weeks left. I'm not, my expectation levels are not that great. The other thing would be there's a whole slew of different possible project ideas that Berger has at the end of every chapter under what he calls, what's he call it? He calls it applications and exercises. You might want to just take one of his exercises, like the one from the interview. Do one of the exercises. Or, if you don't like every part of that exercise, if it's like maybe like a semiotic analysis of like The Prisoner and you don't want to watch The freaking Prisoner, maybe you want to do like a semiotic analysis of something like, like whatever, The Simpsons or Walking Dead or Ozark or whatever you're currently watching or whatever, so everything is on the table, but I would like to know ahead of time, throw me some ideas ahead of time, so at least I kind of know what's coming down the pipe, and we'll do it that way. All right, so I know I've just been kind of all over the place with stuff. Before we get into this, I wanted to draw attention to two films in the pantheon of great documentary interviewers in the genre of the documentary interview. Certainly Earl Morris, the filmmaker Earl Morris, would be on the Mount Rushmore of documentary filmmakers, where the power of the documentary really comes out of the interviews. And he's done a whole bunch of them, but two of the ones that I would strongly, during your summer, your unemployed summer, if you need to do some binge watching, I would strongly suggest watching the one called The Fog of War. That's a powerful, powerful film that he interviews. He does a series of interviews with the former Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and I think it's Kennedy and LBJ. His name was Robert McNamara, and he has a very, very candid talk with Morris about the Vietnam War and his career, and it's real powerful stuff. And Morris always works with the great experimental composer Philip Glass. He's done a lot of films with him, and that one is like... And then one of his earlier films that is more of a kind of investigative, like murder investigative film that kind of like set the bar for that genre, called The Thin Blue Line. The film is called The Thin Blue Line. I can't remember when it came out. It came out in, I believe, early 80s. And within this film, it's an unpacking of a situation with a guy on death row for a supposed murder that he does of a hitchhiker, and ultimately what happens is that through Earl Morris's interviews, ultimately what we find out is that the guy on death row, basically the film got the guy, Earl Morris, making the film and getting certain people to admit certain things, gets a guy off death row. He gets a guy off death row by making a film and getting certain people, and then once you know the board, once the jury board or the penal board saw the film, they were just kind of like, we gotta let this guy go. I mean, that's how powerful that film is. When I teach documentary, I always show Thin Blue Line. Thin Blue Line, very, very powerful, film. Just as like, Nick's picks for today. There's a lot of them I could talk about. I mean, documentaries are just kind of my thing, so I can go on about documentaries like, all day long, Other people are into documentaries, there's other documentary people out there, but none of them are quite as interesting and know as much as I do, about these things, except for like Earl Morris and Michael Moore. It's like there's two other people on this planet that know more about documentaries than I concede it. It's like I'm humble. There are people that know more about this genre. He starts with and I'm going to show it here in a minute. He starts with the Berger. We're going back to Berger. Starts with the opening of a dialogue from a show called The Prisoner that he was a big fan of. We talked to him about that. By the way, it's like I got an email back from him. We chatted a little bit after the talk, and I sent him the link to the blog. Sent him the link to the blog where the interview was, and he said he was going to tell his kids about it. And he also sent me a book that he had done on that when he was talking about Marx is Dead with Sherlock Holmes, and he sent me as a PDF. He sent me as a PDF to read, and if any of you are interested in reading it, I'll send it out to you. But he was great, right? He starts here. I'm going to show it right now. I'm going to show this interview. I'm going to show the beginning of the show, The Prisoner. And show you what he's talking about in this dialogue. Going back to the premise of the show, guy works for the British Secret Service, played by Patrick McGoohan. Ends up, we don't know why, and they show it at the beginning of every episode. It's kind of like the credits that he leaves the British Secret. He's kind of like a James Bond kind of character, but for some reason or another, he resigns. He takes a briefcase. He goes to his room. He's gassed. And he wakes up in a place called The Village, where it's just this kind of weird Orwellian, surreal situation where he's a prisoner for all intents and purposes, and they're trying to get information from him. And it gets really, really interesting. It gets really interesting. I wouldn't dissuade you from watching it. It's cool. I'm thinking about rewatching it myself. I haven't seen it in 15 years, But it's one of those things. It's one of those shows that you should watch if you want to be cool. You should watch The Prisoner and know what The Prisoner is about. So anyway, with no further ado, it's here's the opening to The Prisoner, and here it is.
the village.
What do you want?
Information.
Whose side are you on?
That would be telling. We want information. Information.
You won't get it.
By hook or by crook, we will.
Who are you?
The new number 2.
Who is number 1?
You are number 6.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
So you get a sense of what he's talking about with this. You get a sense of what he's talking about. And he says, in this interview, the interview between number 2 and the prisoner, right? He says, in the interview, notice how the prisoner takes on the role of researcher. He asks questions so he can gain, and they keep on saying, information. You know, what is it that we get out of an interview, if nothing else? You know, it's like we get information. Do we get more than just data? Yes, of course. You know, we get human stories. We get the human drama, you know, depending. But this whole idea of gaining information about what happened to him and follows up on replies by number 2. Number 2 is played by different actors during the show. It's got this whole 60s kind of surreal vibe to the show. And number 2 is the prisoner wants to find out where he is and what number 2 wants from him, who number 2 is, and who number 1 is. You know, who is like the shadowy, we don't know. He's kind of in this inner chamber, so he uses it as his kind of lead-in to the chapter. What's an interview? What does Berger say an interview is anyway? Interviews. What are interviews in regards to mass media? Research. What's an interview? Interviews are one of the most widely used, the most fundamental research techniques, and for very good reason. We use them as research techniques also to gain information about subjects, all right? They enable researchers to obtain information they cannot gain by just observation alone, right? That you can, you know, go to, for instance, you know, some village in Nairobi, outside of Nairobi, or you can go to an airport and study the way that, you know, for instance, Lyon Airport operates, you know, by watching people get on and on, checking their bags, blah, 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 doing all this stuff. You can get all kinds of information like that by observation, all right? But until you engage people and find out what is going, but there's one thing that's lacking in that kind of observation, and that's the whole the whole psychic dimension, you know, of what is going on in people's heads. That if we're going to understand any kind of phenomena, we have to get to that. We have to get to the subjective dimension of it. You know, we need to, you know, whether we're studying about nuclear physicists or whether we're studying about coal mining in West Virginia, until we talk to the people that do it, we really don't have much of a clue. We really don't have much of a clue as to the inner workings of it. It's the way of, like, kind of interviews or like opening up the hood of the car and seeing what the engine is. You know, it's like you only know so much about a car until you open that hood up. And interviews are opening up the hood, you know, and finding out what's underneath it all, what's driving it, what motivates people, you know. And without that picture of, like, certain kinds of phenomena, we're, like, in the dark, right? They enable researchers to obtain information you can't just get from observation alone. Perhaps the simplest way to describe an interview is it's just, what is an interview? It's just another term for, like, a conversation that we have. With more often than not, though, it's not a conversation with the guy on the street. It's a conversation with a goal. There's a goal involved, with the conversation. What am I attempting to achieve, with this conversation? And one could even say that of phone conversations, that more often than not, it's like when I pick up a phone, well, at least before like the pandemic and people just start like, drinking and dialing, it's like calling old girlfriends. I don't do that. But, people are lonely. They just want to hear a voice on the other end. But more often than not, it's like, even with a conversation on the telephone, it's usually I call somebody in order to obtain this, even if it's to find out how they're doing. Interviews are goal-oriented conversations directed at getting information, getting something that I didn't have before or that I didn't know before, or confirm, or often in the situation of finishing up Juggernaut, the IBM documentary, I'm in this position where I just need to confirm things that I've already kind of gotten, but I need to hear it, or I need to have an expert say it. I need to have an expert say it. And with this with this interview that I'm going to be putting on the blog with Mike Shade, when we talk about public relations and the corporate world, that was that kind of interview. That kind of interview where I needed Mike. I got a lot of information from Mike, after doing a lot of research. It's like, but finally I'm sitting in the room with somebody that does this every day. That's his job, to find these things out. And as much as I knew about it, this coming together of this dialogue provided me with some of the stuff that, A, to confirm some of the stuff that I already knew, and B, to get information that I didn't, because you never know what you're going to get, especially if you decide to make a film. You decide to make a film sometimes, and I always say in documentary filmmaking, you need to find, and it was told to me, by people that taught me, you need to find your train. Someone once explained it to me as, you need to find what your train is. All right, what's your goal? What's your topic? And sometimes when you're in that process of getting that, say you want to do something about a certain subject, and you go out and you start getting interviews, and you may find that what you thought you initially wanted to do was not what you wanted to do. Like there's something there, like somebody in that interview process will provide you with a piece that you didn't, and you change your mind due to the fact that, I'm going to give you an example. There was a movie that won a slew of awards back about 15 years ago called Capturing the Freedmens by a very well-known documentary filmmaker by the name of Andrew Jarecki. And him and his brother just made some of the best documentaries that were ever made. And he did this little, and Andrew Jarecki did this little mini documentary on birthday clowns. He did this cutesy little thing on birthday clowns, and he ends up interviewing a guy by the last name of Friedman who was a birthday clown, right? Well, in that interview that he conducted for birthday clowns, he came to find out some real crazy and dark stuff that had played out in this guy's nuclear family, that Jarecki was like, well, wait a minute. It's like, I thought this film was about birthday. He finished the film about birthday clowns. It was this little mini film. But it really led to his most important film called Capturing the Freedmens. Capturing the Freedmens, about this family and these accusations about this high school teacher. His father was a high school teacher that was accused of sexual molestation, and this whole drama. You've got to see this film, Capturing the Friedmans. I used to show it in classes, but we never know what we're going to get with an interview. Sometimes we go out with these preconceptions of what we're going to get, and it changes into something else. It might change into something else. Not necessarily. Okay, so they enable researchers to obtain information they cannot gain by observation alone. Perhaps the simplest way to describe an interview is a conversation between the researcher or the filmmaker, someone who wishes to gain information about a subject, and your informant. An informant is kind of a FBI kind of got a feel to it, like a CSI kind of thing. But ultimately, that's what your interview subject is, and it is an informant, in a strict kind of way. Someone who wishes, you want to gain information, someone who presumably has information of interest on the subject. All right, your informant. So there's the researcher and the informant. And we're going to talk a lot about that relationship that is built and how it differs under different circumstances. We most commonly think of interviews as part of the process of obtaining a job. More often than not, it's like, unless you're a journalist or a documentary filmmaker, the interviews that you're going to have are going to be job interviews, or you're going to work in human resources and interview people. Like a lot of times when I get students to intern on my films, will be a kind of informal, usually it's like, it's kind of like, what? It's like, oh, you want to work on it? Cool. It's like, but it's like, I usually like people that are like competent. We most commonly think of interviews as part of the process of obtaining a job, and most of us have, at one time or another, been interviewed for a job by one or more members of a company where we wanted to work. The goal of these interviews is similar to the goal of interviews conducted by all researchers, to obtain information. Usually it's just, phony and exploitational parlay that goes on. I've been to a lot of these things, believe me. The goal of it is like to obtain information. The term interview is related to the French term entrouve, which means to see one another or to meet. It's a meeting, Entrevue is what it is. There's actually I think there's a famous French film called like Entrevue. This points out an important element of interviewing. Usually interviews, and even like, with Berger, right? It was a face-to-face, in a sense it was a face-to-face interview due to the miracle of Collaborate, right? Usually there's a face-to-face relationship, but not always. Sometimes you do interviews over the phone. A lot of times, like, for instance, I need to go out to San Francisco. I can go see Arthur Berger too. I didn't realize that. Go drop in on Arthur. I got to get out to San Francisco and talk to a well-known toxic tort attorney by the name of Amanda Hawes. All right, and we've never met, but we've logged a couple hours on the phone just talking. So we've never really met face to face, but you start to gather, and same thing with Mike Shade, whose interview you're going to see on the blog. We went back and forth with the emails and blah, 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 until we had this, like, face-to-face. Some interviews are conducted by telephone or other electronic means, such as the internet. When conducting a face-to-face interview, be especially mindful of nonverbal communication. You're always looking for things, I like to think of it as, and this is maybe jumping the gun, but a good interviewer, I use the term, people ask me about giving interviews, and I say things like, you need to make yourself invisible. You kind of need to make yourself invisible. Or so, like, and when I say make yourself invisible as the interviewer, I say that the less you are, there's a nuance, there's a dance to kind of stepping back and allowing this person to get whatever's in there out, all right? And it usually involves this kind of dance of knowing when to ask the right question when. And it's like anything else. It's like politics. It's like diplomacy. That you're interacting with somebody, and you can tell a lot by the way somebody says something, what they're looking at, the inflection in their voice. And it becomes a dance of a type. When conducting a face-to-face interview, be especially mindful of facial expression plays an important role in interviews. You must find a way to establish a friendly relationship. All right? If not, it's like he's talking about research methods. All right? It's like seldom have I found myself in situations where the interview was so adversarial that we didn't walk away civil. All right? Sometimes, and it's like, and this happens all the times in politics, and like on these talk shows, with like, especially like political shows, a lot of times, and we'll get to that with investigative journalism, that sometimes that verbal interchange, it can get very aggressive and heated sometimes to the point where, you ask the wrong thing and the guy walks. You ask the wrong, you get, it's like, and you can tell a lot about it. You can tell a lot about a situation when a guy gets up and walks. That tells you something too. I can tell you something, what they don't say or what they refuse to say or what they get really, really pissed off about you asking about. It says a whole bunch. That provides a whole bunch of information, right? Facial expression, such as, but more often than not, we're all friends here. Why can't we all just get along? As Rodney King once said, smile. You should smile. You should, be genial with a person. And I have a penchant for, getting people to warm up to me. At times, sometimes it's like I've had interviews like go really, really good, and I've had interviews go really, really bad. And usually they're somewhere in the middle. There's somewhere in the middle. So, avoid nonverbal reflections of disapproval or any other kind of judgmental response. Okay. I buy that. You don't want to alienate, your person. You want to put them into a situation where they're comfortable sharing stuff with you. So there's that. There are protocols here. But it's not cookie cutter, and sometimes it's like you're going after something, or you're going after an industry, or you're going after something that's just plain fucking evil, and you're sitting in a room with like, one of the sons or daughters of Satan, and it's like, the gloves can be off. The gloves can be off sometimes. So Arthur, it's like I kind of disagree with you here. Sometimes, it's like you got to kind of go, Rocky, go. You must learn how to maintain eye contact. That is important. You should be able to. It's like a lot of times, it's like sometimes eye contact is prohibited due to the fact that you're a one-man band. All right. For instance, sometimes I'll have to go out for an interview, and I don't have anybody there, and I gotta be a one-man band like I'm doing right now, where I gotta check and make sure that the camera is rolling all right. The one I did with Mike Shade was pretty good because I could maintain eye contact. It's like, I'll explain to you the setup, how I set that one up, so that it was like I was a one-man band with that, but it's like I had everything kind of set up so that I never needed to like not have eye contact with him. Maintaining eye contact, show interest, and to manage, and you need to kind of control the interview too. And that's a dance. Controlling an interview is like that's a different. And we're not talking about dominating an interview. We're talking about being able to kind of deftly move the stream to where you need it to go. You can go out. It's like nowadays. It's like digital film. It's like SD cards are cheap. You can let somebody go off on whatever, all and sundry. you know, but sooner or later, it's like, gotta reel that baby in. Gotta reel that smallmouth bass in. I don't care how big it is, man. It's like, sooner or later, man, it's like, you know, play with it, you know, a little bit. Let him do what he's got to do. And then yank that guy right out of the water. You must learn how to make, nonverbal, and then control the interview. In their book, Nonverbal Communication, Science and Application, David Matsumoto and Hee-Sung Hwang discuss the role that facial expressions play in face-to-face interactions. The face is arguably, and this is from the book, the face is arguably the most prominent nonverbal channel, and for good reason. Of all the so they're calling the face a channel. They're calling the face a channel. I'm having a hard time looking at this thing with this light on right now. They're calling the face a channel. You know, a channel being what? A conduit for emotion. Of all the channels of nonverbal behavior, the face is the most intricate. It's the most complex. It is the most complex signaling system in our body. And I think we can all kind of agree to that the face is the window to the cell. You know, the way that we look at things, the way that, you know. However, there are always times like, I don't know if you noticed, for any of you that are actually watching the videos, if you look at that documentary, A Matter of Heart, about C.J. Jung, or rather C.G. Jung, you'll notice the cameraman, when the woman is talking about something very tense, and I don't necessarily know if it's always a good choice, but the cameraman or woman will go to the way that she's kind of gripping the chair, the way that she's gripping the chair, you know, because at that particular point, that body part is telling us something, you know, is telling us about some kind of intensity, you know. So there's different channels, you know, not just the face. One of the most important signals the face displays is emotion. We know that. We can get all kinds of data from a book, you know. For instance, it's like, you know, I read this like whole book by Shoshana Zuboff, Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and then I watched like an hour, like a documentary about her where she's talking about stuff, and it's a different animal. Then we understand a different aspect of how she emotionally, you know, it's like, it's one thing to read a book by it's like we were with Arthur, right? I mean, can we say that about Arthur, that we read this book by Arthur and then we meet him and we find out, you know, about his character and his personality and his sense of humor, and they're two different animals that together make something else. That make the parts are less than the whole. The parts are less than the parts are less than. So one of the most important signals is the face. Being able to read the emotional states of the person you're talking to is an incredible skill that can help anyone whose profession requires face-to-face interaction, like teaching and other things. Being able to read, right now I can't, you know, right now it's like, you know, I'm at a total disadvantage with this whole nightmarish setup of like speaking to this machine, alright? Because I pride myself on being able to lecture. I think I'm a pretty good lecturer at times. And being able to read, like a stand-up comic, you need to be able to read your crowd. You need to be able to read your crowd, you know. And that's one of the strong components of the interview, right? Is that this dialogue is going on, and it's going on with more than words, all right? And you also have to be thinking, when I talk about like things like making yourself invisible, I'm talking about like a certain way of being with our gestures and our faces and all that, where it's like non-judgmental, you know, and you kind of remove yourself from the equation. for this person to, like, you know, come forth with whatever they got going on. Being able to read other people's emotions can give you insights not only into their emotional states but their intentions. What are their motivations? What are they getting out of this thing? You know, what are they getting out of it? You know, because a lot of times it's like, you know, it's like for the other person, they're doing it, you know, a lot, it's like, seldom do, it's like, I do a lot of, like, begging. I do a lot of begging. I do a lot of, like, knocking on doors and meeting with people, you know, and making it's like people don't just want to jump up and, like, provide you with an interview, you know, depending on what you're doing, you know, or you know, it's not always, like, something that they're doing you a favor. You know, a lot of times when you're getting it's like, I'd like to do an interview with you, and it's either yay or nay, you know, and I get a lot of, it's like lately I got a lot of nays, you know, and some of it was, like, really civil, you know, like I was looking for some people to talk about certain things, and I was meeting with, like, major people. Like I met at Denny's one day with the head of the executive director of New York Publican out of Albany. Can't even remember his name. It's like this last year. I met with him and we were talking, and I thought I thought he was the guy that I needed for the interview. And as we talked, I realized that two things came out of that. One, I didn't get an interview with him. And it wasn't like, no, it wasn't like, Nick, it's like, I do an interview with you, but you want this guy, and this guy. So that it was it was like, and I understood it, and I was just like, you know, you're absolutely right. And it just gave me another lead. He gave me, like, this guy, and this guy, and then a couple other doors got shut too, with, like, people like Judith Enck, like the regional director of the EPA at one point. You know, she was just like, all right. It's like, and there's, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, people are just like, fuck you. You know, it's like, and then you go and find somebody else. You know, being able to read other emotions can give you insights on their intentions, their motivations, personalities, trustworthiness, and credibility. Emotions can inform us of malicious intent, hidden information, or downright deception. You know, and he'll talk about, you know, going, like, you know, any good crime thriller will have the scenes in the courtroom, or have the scenes of the feds or police or DEA or whatever, like, you know, grilling somebody, you know, and all they're doing is lying. You know, you know, and you start to be able to pick up. You start to, no, it's just smoked too many cigarettes this morning. It's not COVID-19, folks. So this book, Nonverbal Communication. Then I embedded some pictures that I just found, some generic pictures of setups, like interview setups, for video. You know, how you want to frame a person and have stuff behind them. And in this situation, it looks like you have the interviewer and a camera person that isn't. Here's another one. You've got a boom mic. You've got an LED light on this guy. You've got a backlight. You know, and this was probably taken from a, like, how-to, like, tech, like, how to light your guy. And how to set your stuff up. You know, I had to, like, for even this, I had to, like, change the whole. You can see over here, like, I had to change the whole the mic setup over here to, like, accommodate the fact that it was humming. You know, this is, like, about setups. You know, and it's important. It's like with that kind, it's important to know the tech. And even Berger will say, it's like, you know, if you're going to use, like, a digital recorder, you know, or a camera, you got to know, you know, don't wait until, like, that day to be looking through the manual. don't wait until that day to be looking at the manual. Know your device, at least to the point where if you need to shoot on full auto, you can do that. Do you need to know every single? It's like, because a lot of times it's like, sometimes I'll like freelance or I'll do a favor for a friend and they'll throw me a camera I've never used before, and I need to, and that usually involves going in. That usually involves going in a little bit early for that guy to be able to, for the person you're working for to say like, here's where this is, here's where that is, here's where the zoom is, here's where the focus is. It's important stuff. Important stuff. Berger talks about 4 kinds of research interviews. Four different kinds of research interviews. Says the informal interview. All right. What's an informal interview? There are a few controls in these interviews. All right. A lot of times, like, interviews are done not just by documentary filmmakers. Sometimes interviews are done by psychologists. Sometimes by sociologists. Sometimes people that are historians. I'm sure Jerry Smith has done a ton of interviews for people to get get history from them. Sometimes you're doing scientific experiments with somebody and there's interviews, right? But those are more controlled. All right. So an informal interview would be fewer controls, on the subject. They just take place. They're not organized or focused and are generally used to introduce researchers to their informants, right? So, I mean, that's kind of like me calling up, like, Mike and being like, or setting up, like, hey, how you doing? It's like, and trying to get, this is what I'm trying to do, and being on the phone with somebody and doing this, like, parlay in which I'm like, this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm working on, and, and getting a sense about where this person's feelings lie about it. Not lie, deception, but where, it's just kind of, we're not talking about everything under the sun, but we're talking in a less form, we're talking about this and that. Like when I got on the phone with when I'm on the phone with Amanda Hawes, we'll talk about other cases. We won't just talk about IBM. We'll be talking about, did you know that, blah, 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 and she'll like, you get other stuff. Unstructured interviews. In these interviews, the researcher is focused and is trying to gain information, but he or she exercises relatively little control over the responses of the informant. And that's the kind that Berger feels most comfortable writing about, unstructured. And he'll even stipulate. When I'm referring to interviews, more often than not, I'm referring to unstructured interviews. How unstructured? Well, I mean, it depends. It depends, I would beg to differ with him about, it's like, more often than not, it's like when I do an interview, there's some structure there. A lot of times, like a lot of times, people will want a question list ahead of time, just to know, not because they've got anything to hide as much as they kind of want to know, like Arthur, he asked me ahead of time, could you have your students send me some questions? I was like, okay. And then, it's like people weren't, I was like, all right, you guys got to send questions. And I get like one the day after it was due. It's like, and I got to like crack the whip. Hey, you got to get your questions in, right? So sometimes people want the questions ahead of time, Semi-structured interviews. Here the interviewer usually has a written list of questions to ask. The thing is with a semi-structured interview is like the one that I did with Mike. I certainly went in with Mike Shade. I certainly went in with several pages and I sent him stuff in advance too. Even that email exchange might be like, no, I'm not going to give you access to the email exchange. But even in the email exchange before the interview, talking about stuff. A lot of times when I talk to Amanda Hawes, it's like boom, 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 boom. I like sit there for like 2 hours, like, this is what I want to know, this is what I want to know, this is what, so that they know ahead of time. That way it's like they don't feel, and the thing about doing that too, it's like anytime, if a person of any importance that you interview is asking you for that, you might, like sometimes it's like, I do it I'll give them questions ahead of time, even though I really don't want to, because what I want to get from it's like I don't want to spook them. I don't want to spook them sometimes, but if somebody's gonna ask you for questions, and give it to them, or give them something, even if it's got to play, even if you're playing softball, you can play. It's like, let's say you want to get stuff out of somebody that you don't know. You got a feeling like they're not going to go there. All right. You don't want to. It's like in boxing they call it leading with the chin. You do not want to lead with the chin. At the same time, you don't want to totally misrepresent yourself either. So it's once again, it's an art and it's a science and it's a game. Focus groups, which are widely used in market research, are considered semi-structured interviews. He says some things about focus groups later on. Focus groups, I need to differ, are not always about product research. You can have like I had a focus group on the documentary, which was kind of like a product research. But later on, he'll talk about the downsides of focus groups, and there are some downsides. What's a focus group? A focus group is when you're, in plain speech, a focus group is when, I gotta turn this around for a second, when, you're interviewing several people at once, almost, but not necessarily. Like if I interview a couple, right, that's not really a focus group. A focus group is usually something that's planned ahead of time, that the people know that there's bullet points, they're going to talk about a certain subject, or they're going to be given a certain thing, and, there are strengths to focus groups too, that there's a kind of interaction, that you don't necessarily get from the one-on-one. But, Berger, I agree with Arthur that, the one-on-one is usually where you get the real meat of stuff. There's no distractions. There's no he said, she said. There's nobody that dominates the group. Because a lot of times with a focus group, you get people that are like dominant, and other people that just, don't feel comfortable, submitting information where in a one-on-one, they might be totally verbal, very verbal. You get them in a focus group with a lot of like dominating like people. It's like they might just shut right down. Structured interviews. Here the researcher. Now, a structured interview would be more of a objective, scientific research interview to get information, to take a certain, they're going to ask you certain questions about, for instance, your use of social media seems to be a big one, but your daily, it's like, we call it ethnography, ethnography, to understand a person, the way that people live, and the choices that they make. Here the researcher uses an interview schedule, a specific set of instructions that guide those who ask respondents questions. All right? You might be doing a research project where you have the same list of 10 questions that you ask every single person. It's very formal. You like transcribe all of your stuff, and then you collate the data. Not unlike the survey, all right? But a survey and an interview are kind of apples and oranges, especially with like a written survey, Here the researcher, so structured interviews. For example, instructions might tell what follow-up questions to ask if a question is answered in a certain way. If a question is answered in a certain way, and I need to change out the battery. For a second, folks. Oh, sorry about that. I had to change out the battery, which will happen sometimes when you're doing an interview. It's like when you're doing a regular interview, you're running out. Your battery will start dying on you. You might have to interrupt a situation and tell a respondent, "Hey, I got to change the battery. Can you hold that thought? And that happens. You're going to see in this one with Mike Shade how we're in the middle of Brooklyn in an office setting, but that's not very well insulated. And there's freaking sirens every 5 minutes. It's like, it's just, it wasn't ideal. And every once in a while, it's like, we were just like, we got to stop, you know, and let the sirens go by and then pick it back up. You know, you need to be responsive to your environment and making sure that, you know, sometimes there's nothing you can do. You know, sometimes there's just nothing you can do. You get into a situation and you just get what you get, you know. And we'll talk more about that later. Sometimes it's like you'll come back from an interview and you'll find something happened. You know, like like the other day I was doing a COM 200 or COM 200 interview video, and I had this unit a little too, for some reason, for whatever reason, all of a sudden it was like getting a hum, and I just like decided not to use it. I had to like fix the situation, you know. But there's always the thing now in the digital age is that, you know, sometimes if you've got something like, if you've got, for instance, an air conditioner that can't be turned off, or a fan or something that can't be turned off, you find a good sound guy and they can usually like notch it out and work with the sound and make the sound better, you know. But having said that, it's like, you know, given the choice between having good or bad, it's like, you know, it's like, don't always operate on this idea that we can fix it in post. You know, make sure that, you know, it's like I was telling, it's like you'll see in the interview I'm telling Mike, it's like sometimes it's like the situation is not ideal. You're not going to do Orson Welles. You're not going to do Citizen Kane. You get what you came for. You get what you came for. You make with it what you can. You know, and some interviews are more beautiful than other interviews because you have the right settings or whatever. But some documentaries aren't about that. They're not about beauty. They're about truth. You know, and they're two different things. You know, so, you know, there's this whole idea of, you know, being able to deal with the unforeseen. Deal with the unforeseen from time to time. And being able to improvise. All right? Why we use interviews? Why do we do it? You know? What's the difference between, and I think we already went over this. You know, we do it due to the fact that, you know, in observation, it's like, and this is a good chart, really, because he's talking about, like, for instance, in observation, I'm seeing something in the present. Whether it be, like, I'm watching some tribal ritual, or I'm watching people at the checkout counter, you know, at, like, O'Hare Airport, you know, or watching people, you know, in a stadium watching a baseball game. You know, it's like, it's the present. With interviewing, I get the past and the present. Why? Because I get memory. I get memories. You know, it's like this person, I mean, you know, human language and human and what we do when we talk to each other. You know, people talk about things like spiritual experiences. You know, like, oh, I had a spiritual experience. It's like, you know, in my philosophy of life, it's like everything is a spiritual experience. You know, when I'm talking to another human being, you know, that's a spiritual experience. You know, I mean, that's just my philosophy on it. But, you know, it's kind of true. This is just really a problem, Buongiorno. It's going to be a problem. Okay, it's not that much of a problem. Interviewing gives us the past and the present. Observation, what's observation give us? Actions. Observations give us actions. When we're watching a baseball game, it's like, you know, we don't really know what's going on in the, you know, with people. We can see body language and stuff like that, you know, but interviewing gives us attitudes. We find out, we get under the hood, we find out what people's attitudes are about something, right? Observation gives us context. Everything happens in a context. You know, that's the strength of observations, right? That things happen in a context. You know, it's one thing, for instance, to look at, you know, footage of, it's one thing to look at a transcript of something, and it's another thing to see it. It's like, it's one thing to hear, just as probably a stupid example, but it's, you have tons and tons of people that, there's always these films on JFK, the shooting at JFK, and it's one thing to have like the experience of watching the Zapruder film. It's another thing to have people explain it to you, gives you attitudes, motive, context. Talk with an interview, you get motivations. Why do people do what they do? Why did they just say what they said? Why did they not say? Why did you do that? Why did you not do this other thing? And it's like investigative journalism. That's very, very important. That film with Robert McNamara that Earl Morris did, Fog of War. That's one. That you've got to see. Observation. We're using our eyes. Interviewing, it's like hearing and probing. And our eyes, but hearing and we're probing. Probing in what sense? It's not like we're poking them with a stick. But we're doing this deft kind of, can you be more specific? And he'll get more into this. He'll get a lot more into this. Berger concentrates on, and I'm going to end this in a second here. I'm just having a hard time, seeing this. I'm going to end with some of the... Berger gives some basic rules of thumb. That everybody should know. That are important, though. They are important. He concentrates on... He says, avoid leading questions. And that's important, too. It's like... And it's important in a lot of different areas, all right? What's a leading question? All right? A leading question... For all intents and purposes, a leading question is a question that is framed in a way and uses a certain set of assumptions that will create, a very limited response, all right, when you want to get something a lot more unbiased. Basically, a leading question is a biased question that leads to, a certain bias in your subject, right? Don't offer leading questions, which more or less push your respondent toward an answer. Sometimes it's like, it's not about getting the answer you want. It's not always about getting the answer you want. And a lot more like local television news people would stop that. The news would be better, but they're usually kids, all right? No offense to some of you guys, all right? But a lot of you guys are kids, all right? And I see this over and over again, that you do these leading questions, but that's part of the game. That's what your handlers, what your masters told you to do, all right? Is it, here, you can, for example, let's imagine you're interviewing a student about a class she's taking, and she says her teacher is unfair. Teacher is unfair. You can respond to this statement in several ways. One way, is that because your teacher favors men over women? I don't know what Martian. I don't know what creature that has lived in a cave his or her entire life would come up with a question like that for. But I mean, it's possible that somebody would ask a question like that. Because because here's the thing, and this is the thing about biased research, right? Sometimes people do that kind of shit all the time because they want to hear, what their prejudice have already, what they already have in their head about a certain thing. That goes with sociology, psychology, journalism, everything. And it runs rampant everywhere, folks. That kind of crap, and even in something as objective as the sciences, all right, the biological and the medical sciences, they're always looking, for, they want, because, it's like, for instance, finding a cure, finding a thing to the pandemic, right? Finding a inoculation for the pandemic. Of course, people want their thing to work. They want their thing to work, because it's going to mean like a lot of money, So it's like, the research involved might, but that's why you have things like testing trials and double blind things and placebo and control groups, because you want to get all that bias out of a situation. Same thing with interviews. Same thing with interviews, my friends. Asking for definitions. What do you mean by unfair? That's less of a leading question. What do you mean by having somebody define their terms? All right, and listening and being able to listen and have people define their terms. This suggests our next point. Have your informants define their terms. If you don't know a term that somebody's using, for instance, if I say something in a lecture and it's like you don't know shit from Shinola about what I just said, for you to not raise your hand and go, Mr. Bongiorno, what is that egghead term that you just used, is just doing yourself a disservice, because sometimes I do have a tendency to use technical or intellectual jargon, and sometimes I think that when I'm in that kind of situation, when you're in that kind of situation, you ask the teacher what he meant. You don't go later on in the student evals and say, this guy, I don't ever know what he's talking about. Don't go on a student eval when you're doing an evaluation of a teacher and accuse him of using all this jargon, not me, but I'm saying anybody else. Don't go accusing somebody of using all this jargon and say, I never understood a word he said, if you didn't ask him what he was talking about. It's kind of a two-way street. If I don't get it, and I'm paying money to take this class, and I want to be, and especially if it's in my major, and I want to have some expertise on this thing once I get to the job market, or whatever's left of it, once you get out of here, it's like, it's no, the fact that there's not going to be any jobs doesn't take away from you being able to brag with the other people in your whatever. It's like that you didn't know what to do with it. Have your informants define terms. If your informants use terms, you gotta ask them. Make them give their own definition of a term. Don't ask them whether your understanding of a term is correct. Don't ask them whether your understanding of a term is correct. Make them give their own definition. All right? Because that person, you guys might have two different views on that. All right? And that's and that's where I'm going to end this right now. Let's keep working. I hope that you are well. I hope I don't know about y'all, but this whole thing with the COVID-19 and all that, it is like, starting to wear me down. I am like, getting a little bit worn out, but not so worn out where I'm not stepping up where I have to step up and being functional about stuff. So, all right. So we'll finish up on interviews next time. And until then, we'll see you next time.